Good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Matthew Harding. I'm the Deputy Dean of the Melbourne Law School, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here this evening for the Francis Gurry Lecture. I'll begin by acknowledging that we meet on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and I'll pay my respects to their elders past and present, and also to any Indigenous Australians who are here with us this evening. I'd like to acknowledge at the outset IPTA. I'm not an intellectual property lawyer myself, and I'm learning now as I prepared my speech notes that I need to be across acronyms if I'm to in any way engage with intellectual property lawyers. So I acknowledge IPTA, the Institute of Patent and Trademark Attorneys of Australia, who are co-hosting this event with the Melbourne Law School. And I also want to acknowledge the generous sponsorship of the International Association for the Protection of Intellectual Property, the Intellectual Property Society of Australia and New Zealand, and the Licensing Executive Society of Australia and New Zealand, each of which has its own acronym that I won't trouble you with right now. A few housekeeping matters. The event this evening is being live streamed and recording will be available from the Melbourne Law School website soon. It's also being photographed. If you're not comfortable with this, please let us know. I'm really not sure what we'll do about it, but let us know. Could I also ask you all, if you haven't already done so, to switch off your mobile phones? For those who don't know, tonight's event forms part of the Francis Gurry Lecture on Intellectual Property series. This series was established by the Melbourne Law School in conjunction with IPTA in 2009. It is named, of course, in honour of our distinguished alumnus, Dr. Francis Gurry, Director General of the World Intellectual Property Organisation, and we're proud to say a Senior Fellow of our law school, a Professorial Fellow of our law school. I'll now call upon Richard Badley from IPTA, who's going to introduce our speaker, Mr. Bill Ferris. So over to you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Matthew. On behalf of IPTA, it's a pleasure once again to be co-hosting this event with a very eminent speaker, Bill Ferris, and we thank you very much for speaking to us tonight. A number of you in the room will be very familiar with Bill, but I think we should give you a little bit of a background as to Bill Ferris, AC. Mr. Ferris was appointed as the chair of the Innovation and Science Australia Board in November 2015. But prior to that, he's had the best part of 50 years' experience in the private equity and venture capital sectors, being a co-founder, for example, of Champ Private Equity, which was founded in 2000. But Bill's first efforts in venture capital go right back to 1970, a year when I wouldn't have known anything about venture capital, I'm afraid. Nor did I. As well as being co-chairman of Champ Private Equity, Bill is a member of the board of the Harvard Business School Asia Pacific Advisory Board. Bill's also held a large number of directorships, and I took a selection. Chairman of the Garvan Institute for Medical Research, Chairman of Accolade Wines, Australia and UK, Austar United, a telecom, one of the first telcos probably, Australian-based telcos, Austrade and Macquarie University Asia Pacific Council. Mr. Ferris was made an Officer of the Order of Australia in 1990 for services to the export industry and a Companion of the Order of Australia in 2008 for his philanthropic activities as a leader in the field of medical research and his role in the establishment of the private equity sector in Australia. In addition to that, Bill has been honoured with a number of awards from his prime industry sector, private equity and venture capital. Bill holds an honours degree in economics from the University of Sydney and a Master of Business Administration from the Harvard Business School, where he graduated as a Baker Scholar in 1970. Bill is also the author of 3 books, including Nothing Ventured, Nothing Gained, and Inside Private Equity. Bill, we're delighted to introduce you to speak to us on intellectual property and the business of innovation, something that is dear to many of our hearts. Thank you very much.
Good evening. What a roll-up. It's a fantastic audience to be invited to address. Thank you. And I should say direct that directly to Professor Megan Richardson. Can you hear me okay, everybody? Yep, good. And thank you, Martin and Richard, for the introductory remarks. There are a lot of acronyms, aren't there? I'll try and, there's one called IPPRI, which of course Megan is involved with, and at the Melbourne Law School for the introduction and coordinating this prestigious event. Thank you for that. And also I acknowledge the Institute of Patent and Trademark Attorneys, IPTA, and the University of Melbourne for your role in also organising the Francis Gurry Lecture Series. So, ladies and gentlemen, patent and trademark attorneys, industry practitioners, I must say Francis's brother Bill Gurry, with whom I go back a long ways, sitting over there. Bill, it's great to see you here tonight. And who reminded me, by the way, that Francis wrote the first IP book ever, I think, in the world, called A Breach of Confidence. Yeah, that's amazing. And others, students and others in the room and in the live stream that is underway, I'm honoured to be able to deliver this 10th Francis Gurry lecture on intellectual property. Given my background, to which Richard referred, in terms of venture capital and private equity, my prism for this lecture is really looking through the prism of that sector. It's a business-focused approach to this lecture on innovation and IP rights. So I'll begin though by sharing with you a brief personal story. As a young teenager, my father, the late Chum Ferris, tinkered with and repaired all sorts of domestic devices powered by that amazing disruptor of his time, electricity. By 1932, at the age of 18, he had scraped together enough pocket money to fund a startup in a sort of repair shop startup in Sydney, repairing and manufacturing home radio receivers. He went on to design and introduce this wonderful product, the Ferris portable car radio, which was the first introduction of such a product into Australia. And it was able to run on its own 6-volt battery, also on a automobile's 12-volt battery system, and then also a 240-volt system in the home. This portable car radio was a new-to-market product, high-quality product, which tapped into the expansionary boom of car ownership and lifestyle wishes of a post-war industrialising nation. In 1960, he patented what was called a gutter grip car aerial, which prevented the need to put holes in your car to put an antenna up for reception. He patented that in Australia and New Zealand, and then in 1963, the company then called Ferris Brothers was granted a patent for a coaxial connector, which was enabling the portability of the car radio. And he did that and by the late 60s, the company employed more than 700 workers nationally. His patenting of this gutter grip and the coaxial connector and the design of this first portable car radio in the country also taught me a an early valuable lesson about the special relationship between IP and innovation, specifically how a robust IP rights system can be a key facilitator of successful innovation. Dad's innovation and entrepreneurship actually inspired my own startup in 1970, to which Richard referred just a few years ago, Australia's first venture capital company set up to back entrepreneurs like my father. I'm going to go back off that. Innovation is the key to a sustainable Australian prosperity, one less dependent upon the natural resources and the performance of our commodities exports and those exports at historically favourable terms of trade, and one more widely driven by the development and commercialisation of our own ideas and inventiveness. History shows us that in the long term, the places and people that practice innovation, new and better ways of making things, doing things, servicing them at home and abroad, they are the ones that keep creating sustainable jobs and prosperity. Innovation, it's not rocket science, innovation drives productivity. Productivity drives GDP growth. GDP growth drives living standards. And fast-growing companies that innovate, export and scale are responsible for virtually all new net jobs in the economy. We have a number of innovative Australian companies that have made their mark on the world stage and demonstrated our ability to punch well above our weight. What we need is many more of these success stories. Companies like Atlassian, CSL, Commonwealth Serum Laboratory, Cochlear, Macquarie Bank and BHP. Bill Gurry, ex-Macquarie banker. I'm sure it's all due to your efforts, Bill. And of course, another Aussie who certainly made it on the world stage and is on the world stage is Dr. Francis Gurry. After obtaining his PhD from the University of Cambridge, he joined the World Intellectual Property Organisation, WIPO, in 85, and between 88 and 99, Dr. Gurry held positions in numerous areas of WIPO, including the Industrial Property Law Section, the Office of Director General, and the Legal Office before becoming now the Director General of WIPO. His current work as head of WIPO is critical in ensuring that the IP system serves its fundamental purpose of encouraging creativity and innovation in all countries. And I commend tonight Dr. Gurry's work and contributions. Fantastic. I also take the opportunity to acknowledge the contributions of IP Australia's former Director General, Patricia Kelly, who I don't think is here tonight. Terry is here in her place. Now you are the new Director General.
The acting Deputy Director.
Excuse me. The acting, I wish you well. The acting Deputy Director. Patricia retired earlier this month, as most of you would know. I understand that over 99% of the 850,000 annual customer activities, transactions handled by IPA Australia, and worth about $200 million a year in revenue, are in fact digital transactions. So that to achieve this, IPA Australia has radically transformed digital customer engagement, positioning IP Australia as the first Australian government service delivery agency to be fully digitised. Australia's IP rights system is a key component of the innovation system, and the improvements Patricia and her team implemented in IPA Australia have been to the benefit of researchers and entrepreneurs to whom we look to now to power this century's knowledge economy. Having a strong national IP agency is important because Australians are an inventive lot. That's the good news. Australian inventions surround us in our everyday lives and form important parts of the Australian lifestyle and national character. And I'm often asked to give examples, so I can reel off a few tonight, because from the stump jump plough enabling broadacre farming, to penicillin, to the atomic absorption spectroscopy, to the black box flight recorder, polymer banknotes, xerography and X-ray crystallography. These are all things that Australians don't realise we actually have invented. And they're not sort of incremental, marginal things. They impact the world's population daily. The cochlear implant, sleep apnea therapy, from novel plants and seeds to Wi-Fi technology from Cyro, the vaccine for cervical cancer, we branded Gardasil, spray-on skin repair, things like the identification of Helicobacter as the cause of ulcers and so on. And this inventiveness does continue at the cutting edge of science and research. In June this year, here in Melbourne at the WEHI Institute, Professor David Huang and an amazing team of researchers around him won the prestigious 2018 AIPSANZ. You know that acronym? Yep, the Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering, AIPSANZ. They won the Clunies-Ross Award for knowledge commercialisation with the anti-cancer drug venetoclax. And this drug has proved effective in treating chronic lymphocytic leukemia and has been explored for potential application to other types of cancers. Especially innovative when I heard about venetoclax was WEHI's sale of portion of its royalty rights to a Canadian pension fund in a deal worth $400 million. And such an advance of royalties would never have been possible absent a thoroughly protected family of patents. And this in turn has enabled WEHI to significantly expand their cutting-edge research and commercialisation activities. And we hope ultimately improved health outcomes for Australians and patients around the world. It's a great reminder that the excellence in research and excellence in commercialisation are not mutually exclusive. And they're not mutually exclusive endeavours in research institutes and universities, as well as corporations around this country and elsewhere. However, as hugely impressive as all of these examples are, the evidence confirms that in recent years our innovation system has increasingly been falling behind that of our competitive nations, our OECD trading partners, and others including Israel, Singapore, Taiwan, China, South Korea. Disruptive technologies, especially digital, are a pervasive force for change in all parts of our economy. Indeed, from ISA, again, the acronym for Innovation and Science Australia, from ISA's perspective, it is that in the past decade, Australia has moved from a once-in-a-century mining boom into a world innovation race. And it's a race where IP is at least as valuable a resource, much more really, than iron ore and oil and wheat and wool. Access to and creation of knowledge, and hence IP, will become increasingly important as Australia moves further into this digital age. While our 26 years of unbroken economic activity is literally a world record, we will need to lift our innovation game across the country if we are to extend that for another 26 years, as we would all hope. Excuse me. I mentioned before that Francis Gurry is currently the head of WIPO, and so we are, in a sense, indebted to him for helping us to understand how we place in this global innovation race. WIPO's annual publication of the Global Innovation Index, the GII, provides a series of metrics for the innovation performance of 126 countries around the globe, representing 91% of world GDP and of population and about 96% of world GDP. The current data, which is broadly in accordance with ISA's own performance review of the Australian Innovation Science and Research System, suggests that while we have a proud history of invention, there is much more to be done to extract the commercial benefits that we could be experiencing were our innovation system performing more efficiently and ambitiously. The 2018 GII index was released in July and indicated some mixed results for Australia's performance. And briefly, overall, we ranked 20th out of 126 countries. Doesn't sound too bad. And in 2017, we were 23rd, so it's an improvement. But if you look at the 45 or so high-income countries, we rank 19th, the real comparison. Australia ranks 6th among the 15 countries in our region, Southeast Asia and Oceania. The strengths include a first in tertiary enrolments metrics, second in government's online services, a 7th in the ease of starting a business, and 16th, what do you know, in venture capital deals. So that is a rapidly expanding and improving metric for Australia. The weaknesses include, if you look at the patent profiles, we are considered a weakness relative to the top 25 countries. Australia ranked 69th in STEM graduates, the metric for STEM graduates per population, 84th in the percentage of gross R&D, national gross spend on R&D, finance from offshore. It's an interesting stat. While these types of metrics, indices will always draw questioning about accuracy and composition, etc., the broad findings made in these GII indexes they do pretty closely accord with our own research, suggesting that Australians are not innovating anywhere near the levels we need to fulfil the ambitions in the global knowledge economy. The ownership of ideas and activities is the lifeblood of any innovation system. The use of patents, trademarks, copyright, trade secrets, along with other IP rights, are important tools to ensure that the value from new ideas can be optimised commercially and socially. There's a great recent example that illustrates this symbiosis. In Byron Bay, New South Wales, a father and son duo, Stuart and Cedar Anderson, are the inventors behind the Flow Hive, Australia's most successful crowdfunding program so far, launched via Indiegogo's crowdfunding platform in late 2015. Flowhive reached their funding target of $72,000 in just 8 minutes from opening. Bang, 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 click, 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 got it, 70,000. The Flowhive is the most significant beekeeping invention since the Langstroth beehive, which of course you'll all know about, I'm sure. It turns out that this was an invention from a Reverend Langstroth in Philadelphia, patented in 1852. And he discovered the bee space measurement. These were dimensions that informed the industrialization of modern beekeeping. He observed that if the space that bees inhabited was too small, the bees couldn't build a comb for honey. His book, long title, but The Classic Beekeeper's Manual, is still available to purchase and is a common reference point for beekeepers even now. So in anticipation of the commercial value of their method, which built on the knowledge of Langstroth, the Flowhive's investors registered for a provisional patent before launching the crowdfunding campaign. It was granted due to their invention's unique split cell technology, a plastic honeycomb matrix on which the bees complete with their own wax. Since its launch, the flow hive has been recognised not only for the innovative method, but also for its unique design. And in 2016, the flow hive won Australia's most prestigious prize for design, the Good Design Award. And to date, the company has sent out over 50,000 beehives to more than 100 countries. It's a great exemplar of inventiveness plus patent rights enabling innovation. But one success story, or the many dozens more that this audience, I'm sure, could tell if time allowed, doesn't mean that all is okay in our national innovation system. On the contrary, the economy-wide evidence strongly indicates that Australian businesses are not innovating enough. And this is true whether you look at spending on R&D or development of new-to-world products or Australia's patent filing record. If you take IP Australia's 2018 report, which highlighted that while patent applications grew overall in 2017, applications for standard patents by Australian residents actually fell. They decreased by 5%. Taking a longer-term view over the decade to 2016, resident patent filings by Australian firms declined by 8%, while they increased at the European Patent Office by 16%, residents of Europe, and in the US Patent and Trademark Office by 33%. And then I found that the same stats for residents filings in China over that period have grown by 885%. Call it 1,000%. Ours have declined. I also note, not without a sense of irony, that the most prolific domestic filer of patents in our nation of gamblers is the aristocrat poker machine company. Good luck to them. With 157 applications, that compares with the second most prolific filer, the CSIRO, with 45 applications. As I briefly mentioned before, of course, CSIRO scientists developed some of the key technologies underpinning Wi-Fi, and only after engagement in a long court battle did they secure returns from the related intellectual property. And the irony continues when you note that the second largest foreign filer in this country, in Australia last year, was Qualcomm, the US-based company, and its equipment to deliver Wi-Fi and other wireless communication technologies. The Wi-Fi is key to Qualcomm's product portfolio. So in something of an understatement, CSIRO Chief Executive Larry Marshall recently said, in respect of those patent stats, I think Australia needs to lift its game. Recognising the innovation imperative before Australia, the government launched the National Innovation and Science Agenda at the end of 2015, and inter alia created Innovation and Science Australia as an independent statutory authority tasked with assessing the ecosystem for innovation in this country and tasked with coming up with a strategic plan out to 2030 that would help lift the country's performance. I was invited to chair the board, comprised mainly of private sector innovation practitioners, and including our deputy chair, the chief scientist, Alan Finkel, and we have a CEO who's present here tonight, Dr. Charlie Day from Melbourne. And ISA's strategic report to government, entitled Australia 2030, Prosperity Through Innovation, was publicly released earlier this year. It is a plan to realise a vision that by 2030, Australia will be counted within the top tier of innovative nations. To get there, we called out 5 imperatives to be tackled if Australia is to close the present considerable gap in innovation performance between it and key competitor nations. The first of these imperatives is all about education. The nation will only achieve the potential economic and social prosperity envisaged in our plan if we are able to equip our kids with jobs and skills relevant to 2030. Our recommendations for this imperative focused on strengthening teacher training, reviewing and strengthening the vocational education training system, the VET system, to restore its reputation, to restore its resourcing, to restore its relevance, to expand it, and better preparing students for post-school science, basically post-school STEM subject is what we were emphasising. The second of the imperatives came under the heading of industry. We need to ensure Australia's prosperity by stimulating many more high-growth firms and raising productivity as a result. Australian business simply isn't investing in innovation at the rate seen in the business communities of our competitors. And more alarmingly, the trend in this investment has been falling since the GFC of 2008. The reversal of this downward trend is a top priority in the plan, and our recommendations included changes to the balance of indirect tax and other direct incentives to propel business investment in R&D. I will talk more about this and how it relates to IP and patent filing later in my speech. A third imperative was really about how government must become a catalyst and can become a catalyst for innovation and be recognised as a global leader in innovative service delivery. In this third imperative, our 230 report identified the big opportunities for government in its own activities to adopt more innovative policy development, policy implementation, service delivery, procurement practices, access to data and the curation of their data, etc. A big win for this imperative was the government's announcement in May of an independent review of the Australian Public Service. This was one of our recommendations, and they responded to that. We recommended, and I quote, to conduct a review of the Australian Government Public Service with the aim of enabling a greater role and capability for innovation in policy development, implementation and service delivery. In this imperative, we also identified a strategic opportunity for government to embrace a more flexible regulatory environment that supports innovation. There is significant work underway to improve Australia's legal and regulatory framework to enhance innovative activity, including the passage of legislation to amend insolvency laws and following some of the Productivity Commission's 2016 review of Australia's IP laws. A fourth imperative is all about research and development nationally. We need a step change improvement in collaboration for commercialisation. In the G2 metrics that I referred to earlier, we badly lag our competitor nations in translating and commercialising of our intellectual property. And the level of collaboration between business and researchers is also lagging our competitors. The contribution of Australian industry to higher education, R&D, is just 5%, well below and below the average of the OECD countries. We need to quickly reduce the intellectual and physical gulfs between industry and research institutes. I think in mine, and I know Charlie's experiences as well, we actually find at the moment that universities and researchers are doing more to reach out to business than business is actually reaching into academia. It's an old cultural set of silos that we're still dealing with. Way better today than it was even 5 years ago, but boy, have we got a long way to go. A fifth imperative is about culture and ambition. I have enjoyed making a career of investing in talented Australians, be they in not-for-profit organisations or in the corporate world, people who have gone on to achieve quite remarkable things. So I know ability is not the barrier to Australians succeeding globally. Where I do see a gap between Australia and our competitors is in the level of our aspiration, our ambition, and our willingness to tackle very big problems at a global scale. So in this fifth imperative, we identified for national attention was the absence of any embedded innovation culture in Australia. Inter alia, we called for adoption of large-scale, what we called national missions, to address major challenges and opportunities now faced by the Australian economy and society. Missions of scale and significance, which if achieved would demonstrate to all Australians, young and old, the excellence of our own science and implementation. Missions which, if tackled by the collaboration of our best and brightest scientists, entrepreneurs and innovators, would over time help stimulate a culture of innovation, a love of and a respect for making and doing things better and smarter. It's not much more complicated than that as a concept. But you can't talk about it if you're a politician, it seems. I think we do in this room must talk about it. We therefore welcome the government's announcement in May 18 of the Australian Genomics Futures Health Mission with 500 million over 10 years of extra funding. This funding comes via the Medical Research Future Fund, and this was one of the national missions that we called out and recommended to enable Australia to one day become the healthiest nation on earth. That's ambitious. It's actually achievable in my view. We're running at about 6th now. Why not be the best? We can get there if we try. As I mentioned earlier in my speech, the decline in business investment in R&D, and business investment in R&D, the international acronym is BIRD, B-E-R-D, so I'm going to use BIRD from now on if you don't mind. That decline is an issue that needs to be tackled urgently by government and business and other key stakeholders if Australia is to become a top-tier innovative nation. Indeed, the ambitions we outlined in the 230 plan can only be achieved if there is a dramatic improvement in BIRD. BIRD's the single largest component of a nation's total R&D spend, the acronym for which is GERD. If the following, in the following graph, which is actually a is actually a Reserve Bank of Australia graph. You'll observe the decline in Australia's GERD as a percentage of GDP at a time when it is rising in the OECD. So the red curve you see there is ours declining from about 2.2% of GDP down to 1.8% since the GFC. At the same time, the OECD nations grew north, they're up to about 2.4% of GDP. And the size of this divergence and its direction is even starker when you compare Australia with the top 5 OECD countries that now average 3.7% of GDP. Double what we are investing in research and development. So this is the situation that warrants, in our view, significant national attention now. The next graph. The heading, why the massive difference in BIRD. You'll see that there are 3 columns. It's a bit of a busy page, but I can walk you through it quickly. The left-hand side column is GERD, the national total. The middle column is what business does, BIRD, and the last column, number 3, is government, is the government spend, GovERD. If you consider the international comparisons in this slide, there's 12 countries there. Take 3 of them, Australia in red, Germany in yellow, South Korea in green. And as the third column slide shows, in all 3, the expenditures by government are the same, 0.9% of GDP. But look at the very different investments by business in the middle column. 1% in Australia, the red entry, 2% in Germany, the yellow one, 3.3% of GDP in South Korea, the green one. Putting it another way, the leverage on public sector, the public sector investment isn't overtly the problem. It's the same in all those 3 countries. But look at the difference in Bird and then think the leverage on the public sector investment is only 1.1 times in Australia, 2.2 times in Germany, 3.7 times in South Korea. In Israel, if you do the calc, it's 5 times. So why the massive difference? Is it cultural? Is it the quality of currently available government support programs? What is it? Our hypothesis is that a key path to address the disparities here should be through rethinking the form, not just the amount, of the government support for business R&D in this country. It's very different to the form in most of our successful competitors. Evidence, next slide. Same countries, but what this shows is that the majority of incentives in our competitor countries are direct, not indirect. Indirect being tax-based agnostic incentives. So in some countries like Germany, Sweden and Israel, they have 0 indirect tax-based incentives. So you see the blue line, and the orange line demonstrates Australia there at the bottom, depending on, with a dependence of 85% of our incentives on indirect research and development tax incentive. We believe a smarter rebalancing of these support mechanisms is overdue and will be essential to reversing Australia's decreasing levels of business investment in R&D, in innovation. So what do I mean by direct and indirect? Just a quick additional comment on that. The major incentive for business from the Australian government comes via the indirect research and development tax incentive, agnostic as to sector, self-assessed and continually available regardless of performance outcomes. Never mentions collaboration or requires it or measures it. Whereas direct incentives seek to powerfully leverage government investment in innovation, and have the following characteristics and objectives. 1 is to expand availability of risk capital. 2 is to expand access and size of markets. And 3 is to leverage collaboration for commercialisation. If you can go for those 3 things, you'll get a much bigger multiplier on the government effort. A few examples of these sorts of direct incentives might be helpful. So going to the first one about expansion of risk capital, the availability of risk capital. Governments can provide subsidies, or they can provide tax breaks, or they can co-invest. And where scale and or risk otherwise intimidates and holds back activity in the small domestic market economy of Australia, government co-investment can leverage private sector action. Think the recently established Biomedical Translation Fund, the BTF. This is a 500 million new venture capital fund established with ISA's recommendation and guidance, with 50-50 sharing of equity funding by the government and private sector investors. The rationale for this fund was to ensure we don't continue to squander the fantastic health and medical research breakthroughs achieved by our researchers around the country. The 500 million of VC, managed by 3 private life science managers, is now available for development of new drugs and devices through clinical trials into the marketplace. Since getting up and running in 2017, the BTF has already provided venture capital of almost $80 million to 12 young companies commercialising a range of exciting innovations, including a breakthrough in a particular kidney disease treatment, novel treatments for peanut allergies in kids, and a wearable medical technology that helps Parkinson's sufferers to much better self-manage their disease. Without the availability of the BTF risk capital and expertise, these breakthrough products and the IP that goes with them would continue to drift offshore or just die in the labs. This leverage, which government co-investment delivers, is exemplified by the way it has attracted and enabled some of the nation's leading superannuation funds to match the government's $250 million with the long-term and patient risk capital you need for this sort of risk investment and commercialisation. And until recently, the super funds avoided this. Too risky, too small, too hard. But in this BTF, there is private sector dollar for dollar skin in the game, and the individual projects are selected not by bureaucrats in Canberra, but by experienced life science managers who tendered for the task. The BTF, in our view, demonstrates the power of targeted co-investment by government. So that's one form of what I mean by direct. The second talks about expansion of market size and access. Government as a large and innovative customer, the government spends 50 billion or so every year, so it's kind of like a big corporation, and does that via something over 60,000 contracts per annum with business. The success of international initiatives, better utilising this procurement power, suggests that we should try harder here. Following the NISA announcement, the government launched the Business Research Innovation Initiative, another acronym, BRII, BRI, we call it BRI, good cheese. This was based on other nations' established procurement experiences with challenge grants. In particular, we researched the US Small Business Research Incentive, which has been so successful in that country. And we've rolled out, we helped design and roll out this BRI pilot program, which has 2 primary objectives. One is to solve problems and opportunities identified by government departments, problems they have to solve, by funding SMEs able and willing to create prototype and test innovative solutions. And secondly, to enable scale-up and commercialisation of such solutions to a wider customer base, both domestic and international. A great contemporary US example of what's possible. I'll just quickly mention a company called Illumina, which is now a global leader in genome sequencing equipment. It received its first SBR award in 1999, and in January 2014 announced a milestone in life sciences by introducing a system that researchers can use to sequence the genetic code of a human for approximately $1,000. I know about this company because we purchased the first Illumina equipment in Australia at the Garvan Institute a few years ago. Today, that company has grown to over 5,000 employees globally and generating multi-billions in annual revenues. These challenge grants can work. I won't bang on too much more about access to market size, other than that the other way, of course, is to expand the export development grants program that we have. Consumer households in Asia expected to double from 600 million today to 1.2 billion by 2030, which is the horizon for our report. you know, while this offers fantastic opportunities, our distance from these Asian export markets is an issue. The distinct cultural, the linguistic, the regulatory, the business environments within these markets are significant barriers to entry. And we believe there is a very large multiplier opportunity via a significant expansion in targeted EMDG programs aiming at high growth companies. Given exports are a strong proxy for innovative and competitive performance, we view this as a very effective direct program warranting expansion, significant expansion. If we're not mucking around, you know. Grants which leverage collaboration for commercialisation, I'll just mention one example of that, which is in the Cooperative Research Centres program. This has achieved a leverage since it began, actually a couple of decades ago, of greater than 4 times what the money put in by government. More than matched 4 times by academia and industry. It's been successful and indeed copied by others offshore. For example, the Catapult program in the UK is modelled really on the CRCs. One of those you may or may not have heard of, the Capital Market CRC, is a great example, started by, with a few others, but Professor Michael Atkin from the University of New South Wales, and he was 2 years ago, the winner of the Prime Minister's Prize for Innovation. He developed the software, the CRC developed the software that could define and test fairness and efficiency in financial markets. It spun off its real-time surveillance software that services regulators, exchanges, brokers in capital markets, and has been accredited with reducing instances of insider trading by over a quarter, by 26%, and now adopted by more than 40 national exchanges around the world, including NASDAQ, and regulators and 150 brokers across 50 countries. It has generated hundreds of millions of dollars of revenues. It's a fantastic, world-class piece of business, piece of software nobody's ever heard of. I could go. I've got quite a few examples. I'm running out of time, so I won't go on about that. But these are some of the direct measures I wanted to point out tonight that are available to correct the imbalance in our business incentives and to reverse the decline in bird. Importantly, this is not just about government. To be clear, we believe that an appropriate reallocation by government of its current indirect incentive expenditures of $3 billion per annum can fund most of the direct measures referred to. And the real response, the real multiplier, will come from business. So, in conclusion, I can assure you that I and Innovation Science Australia, we intend to continue the important conversation with government about how to go about getting a better and smarter balance into our support measures for business R&D. But we do need the IP professionals in this room tonight and colleagues across the nation to join us in relentlessly prosecuting the case for innovation, for accelerating innovation. If you'll excuse the pun, it should be patently obvious that the prosperity of our children and our grandchildren depends on it. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Megan Richardson. I just wanted to say thank you, Bill Ferris. That was wonderful. That was absolutely fascinating and leaves us with a great deal to think about, including for universities. Just before I move on to questions, and we're only going to have time for 1 or 2, so very quick ones, because Bill has a deadline to get to the airport. I just wanted to thank my colleague Andrew Christie, who, as many of you know, has been a tireless engine of support for and actually initiator of the Gurry Lecture Series. And unfortunately, he's not here with us today because he's at Cambridge University, but watching, I think, the live stream. Can I now ask if there are any questions or very short comments?
You mentioned that universities are doing more to reach out to industry with respect to innovation and research than vice versa. I'd be interested to hear more about that and why you think that's the case.
You're from CSL, Richard. CSL is a great supporter of the BTF program and an investor in one of the funds, which is fantastic that they led by example. And John Shine, the former director of the Garden, is still chairman of CSL. We're finding that the excitement on campuses like in Melbourne and Monash and the G of 8 and all the other 40 universities around the country pretty much, there's a bottom-up push from students, and you've heard it many times, they don't want a job, they want to make their own job. They're pushing up on the faculty, they want accelerator and incubator activity on campus, they want to give it a go. It's really fantastic energy compared to just 5 or 10 years ago. And from the Vice-Chancellors down now responding to the new block, the changes in the determination of how you get your research grants, the block research grants, you've got to demonstrate industry engagement. The behavioural, that's still got a fair way to work through before it becomes a true metric. But the behavioural response already from Vice-Chancellors on down is fantastic. I think, the universities, Charlie and I get around, and I'm sure you get around, they're dead serious about reaching out to industry. They're keen to say, come and have a look at what we've got. I was 3 weeks ago talking to the G of 8 seminar. It was a 2-day thing on genomics and precision medicine. And I was pointing out that in America, I'd just seen this study about the composition of boards in America. And 40% of the companies in the S&P 1500, the major corporations, 40% of them have a professor, at least one professor in the boardroom. And you could probably count on one hand in Australia, and they wouldn't own up to it in Australia if they had a professor. Probably, I'm being a bit too cynical about that. But I asked the G of 8 faculty group, 120 or so there, admittedly in the healthcare sector faculty, who had been on a board, 2 hands went up. If invited, would you seriously consider it worthwhile to be on a public company board? And 2/3 went up. So there's a mismatch of resourcing here. There's a fantastic startup here for somebody to actually build a search firm that just does that, domain strength to corporate requirement, etc. So it's a bit anecdotal, but I think the evidence is very clear that universities, research institutes, CSIRO are pushing very hard and fast, and businesses still slow to respond. And I think the direct incentives is part of that, making that response, really propelling it.
You've given us a number of examples in the area of R&D from medical research institutes, and it seems to me that what these have in common is a mandate for research and development, but also a very successful formula for infrastructure, and we do that extremely well. But if you look at medium-sized businesses and those further down, it seems to me that what is lacking here in Australia is their infrastructure for doing R&D. You have already spoken about incentives and what we need to do in that direction, but it seems to me that there is an enormous lack in what the infrastructure might look like from their point of view, and that they have no structure to perform in that regard. So I think I'm wondering whether that is something that you obviously have considered it, but what that might look like and what exemplars we could find that could provide that kind of role model?
Well, it's a good question. I think the answer is not complex, but it comes in parts. At the top, we did back a recommendation, and Chief Scientist Alan Finkel did a lot of work on this to get an assured NCRIS, a big infrastructure spend out 10 years, and the government signed off on 1.9 billion, pretty close to 2 billion in the last budget. And that was an increase at a time when they were looking for savings, etc., in the forward estimates. So not a bad outcome, mainly, and not just for big end of town. It is accessible for smaller companies, etc. I think the other push that's on, though, and we probably should do more of, and I think it will happen, is the concept of clusters of precincts with industry. So Carlton Connect here, and the Monash and University of Melbourne BioCurate, is that the right name? This bringing together of researchers seriously interested in getting into the marketplace and vice versa. The precincts here and offshore that we've looked at do provide infrastructure for young companies. And of course, the existing accelerators and incubators, 10 years ago, you could say there were 4 or 5. There's probably 50 or 60 now around the country. The venture capital availability, which is a financial infrastructure requirement, because you need the venture capital and you need the expertise to go with it. It used to be me and a dog back in 1970. The dog did better. And now it's very sophisticated, high quality venture capital infrastructure. So the small, different answers at the small end and the big end. I think the other other infrastructure stuff you'll get through the national missions approach is good. So whether it's the space sector being identified or the genomics and precision medicine, we hope maybe hydrogen will get up as an energy source, etc. That will drive infrastructure too. It's a complex thing.
Thank you. So I'd just like to now hand over to Luke Merrick to say a very quick final thank you.
Thanks, Megan. Well, on behalf of the sponsors, could I thank Bill for a very engaging and insightful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll only say one other thing about it, and that is, as an IP practitioner, we very rarely get to focus on the commercial, but equally importantly, the social context in which we deal with IP, and I think it's very refreshing to have that perspective exposed. Given the time, I'll leave it there, except to say that I'd like to thank Melbourne Uni for its support of this lecture, which is a critical part of the IP landscape in Australia. Thank you.